So much like Mel Brooks' classic movie, I've had to skip a lot. The first deck I pulled together for this talk was more than an hour and a half long. Also, like Mel's movie, this is really skewed to early history, not really current events. But first I want to introduce myself because I have been working on the web platform for a super long time, just over 27 years. I've been an engineer, a PM, a group program manager, developer advocate, a standards editor, a working group chair. I'm currently in the Chrome TPGM team, Google's W3C advisory committee rep for my sins. And I worked on very early browsers first, and then I spent 15 years at Microsoft working on IE. And I came to Google almost 10 years ago. That's right after we shipped Chrome version 6, by the way. And there's more to this talk than just the IE era, but I still believe IE and a lot of the driving factors behind Internet Explorer were really important in getting us to where we are today. So I do want to start, though, by saying that don't get the wrong idea. I don't think I'm the smartest person in the room, certainly not in this virtual room full of chromies. To borrow a Hamilton quote, though, I have been in the room where it happened many times over the years. So I want you to cast your minds back, possibly to before you were born. In 1998, I went to the University of Illinois as an undergraduate. And to give you a picture of the internet at the time, pretty much no one had heard of it. It was still commonly known as ARPANET. My incoming undergraduate class was not actually issued a student email account by default. You had to go into the computer lab and request one, and you got an account on this mainframe system, and you had a time limit of like 7 hours a week, which I would usually burn up playing Ultimate Larn or ULarn. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of ULarn at this point, but I would burn through all my time in the first couple days of the week playing ULarn, and then I couldn't check my email again until Saturday morning when the clock reset. But thankfully, engineering students got a separate account for classwork on a different mainframe with no time limit, also with no ULarn installed and no sysadmin privileges. But clearly, because of this, I managed to pass my computer science classes. And this was my first internet terminal, by the way. This was a cast-off HP 2622A terminal. It's from the early 1980s. It was out of date when I got it, free from a boss at my summer job. But I had it connected to the U of I's system via smoking fast 2400 baud modem, which I actually still have with me today. For reference, my cell phone gets something like a 60,000 times faster connection on LTE. My home network connection is something like 60,000 times faster. Or for reference, this 2400 baud modem is about the same speed as average hotel room Wi-Fi in Mountain View. But this was just a text terminal. Connection speed wasn't really as important anyways, because ASCII was pretty much all you were going to get. And by the way, don't worry, my presentation is not just a long stream of Douglas Adams quotes, although take bets now on how many there are. But this quote about the natural order of things always rang true to me. Like anything invented before you're born, it's just simply the way the world works. I have two kids, 10 and 15, and it's amazing to me what they take for granted. They don't remember a world before smartphones. I mean, the younger one was actually born after the iPhone was released. But then again, anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting, and you can probably get a career in it, basically like I did. And anything invented after you're 35 is just against the natural order of things. Now, for reference, I am well over 35. And I'm not here to say, get off my lawn, you young whippersnappers. The web's been done. Because I'd like to be clear, I turned 35 before Chrome was even released. The challenge to me is how to turn this on its head and say, how can you get amazed and excited by things that you feel like are against the natural order? How do you go figure out how those things occurred? How do you further change the natural order in interesting ways? How do you keep your natural order flexible? So back to my story. In 1991, I got a part-time job at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois. It's the last time I'm going to spell out what NCSA stands for. The NCSA is one of the 5 original National Science Foundation supercomputing centers. Our group's mission was to build software tools to enable researchers to use desktop-level workstations to access the supercomputers, to run visualizations and simulations on them. So we built visualization tools. We built software tools like Telnet. Like, we literally built Telnet, the terminal program. In fact, that's what I was hired to do, was to work on PC Telnet. Because this was pre-Windows 95. There was no TCP IP stack in Microsoft OSs. PC Telnet was MS-DOS software, and we had our own networking stack with individual network drivers for every different kind of card you might have. And I remember debugging the TCP resend fallback algorithm and writing network card drivers. Like, we also built image and data visualization tools. It wasn't all Telnet. But in 1992, I graduated from the U of I, and I liked my part-time job so much that I just kind of hung around and turned it into a full-time job, heading up the Windows software team, team of undergrad students. And in 1993, a couple of guys at NCSA, they came up with this project on X Windows that they called Mosaic, which accessed and displayed internet content from FTP, Gopher, and this thing a crazy guy in Switzerland had come up with called the World Wide Web, which used a prototype document language called HTML. And I co-wrote the Windows version of NCSA Mosaic with one other guy. And this is pretty much what happened to the rest of my career. And in fact, by the way, this has utterly ruined the word mosaic for me, because I never get a mental image like this when somebody says the word mosaic. My brain flashes up this instead. And throughout this talk, I'm going to identify some of the life lessons that I've picked up along the way. Feel free to ignore them. There's not going to be a quiz. But the first one of these lessons is choose your product names and code names carefully, because the words may be forever tainted for you. A later team member called the project Yucatan because he thought we should all get to go to the Yucatan Peninsula, Cancun, when the product shipped. And yeah, that product never shipped. I have been to Cancun, though, so there's that. But keep in mind, at this point, you didn't typically even have network support in Windows. Prior to Windows 95, Windows didn't come with a TCP IP stack. There's no WinSock. You could buy a separate package from a third party. It was usually hundreds of dollars. Then you actually had to pay for dial-up service, which was measured in dollars per minute in those days. Dollars per minute. Think about that for a minute. And now you owe me a couple of bucks. But at NCSA, we already had our own networking stack for our PC Telnet work. So we got it running under Windows. We built the HTML parsing and rendering stuff, and Mosaic was up and running. Now, NCSA had a tradition of shipping beta releases early and often. We did lots of test software and test releases. I remember getting up to beta version 22 of Telnet once before we actually cut in a real release that we called final. But we put Windows Mosaic up on our FTP server. And I remember how happy we were. We were cheering in the office, sitting around a computer when we ticked past 1,000 downloads in about a week. Now, by contrast, Chrome has like 3 billion users and a really fast uptake rate for auto-updating. So I'm pretty sure we just ticked past 1,000 downloads when I snapped my fingers. Like, what was really surprising, though, about this whole thing was that same year, 1993, the game Doom came out. And we still managed to get any work done whatsoever on Mosaic because we were addicted to Doom in NCSA. But I want to underscore, like, we were college kids driving this project, right? Like, we didn't really have a strong idea of what we were doing. If you look closely in the URL at the address bar, you'll see it ends in .edu. We got to build Mosaic, even though it wasn't part of our academic charter, because it was an interesting software tool for education and research. And that was NCSA's overall charter. We got a lot of freedom to build tools that would help education. And we didn't really need a business plan. I mean, I guess there were a bunch of .coms that came along a few years later that didn't think they needed a business plan either. But we really didn't. Like, granted, sometimes we were working on a shoestring. There were 2 of us working on NCSA Mosaic for Windows, and we worked on PCs that didn't have a shared network drive because drive sharing for PCs was super expensive at the time. And we would literally work in different areas of the code and then copy stuff onto zip drives, walk across the office to the other person's computer, and use WinDiff to recombine the source code. Like, we didn't have user experience courses in my CS curriculum. We didn't have theory of software testing. Maybe that showed up in our code quality too. But that leads me to my second lesson, which is the freedom to go down rabbit holes and explore things is an amazing tool. And this is what I really immediately loved about Google's 20% time when I first came to the company. Like, people outside the company thought 20% time was crazy. It was like we all got a day off a week or something. And that's not really it. It's a license to explore things. And this isn't to say that we didn't make some foolish choices when we chose to explore things back in the day. For example, I am personally responsible for overlapping tags working in early browsers and in HTML. This rampant violation of all common sense, all SGML structured element decency in parsing, this was my fault. I think I first implemented this in Mosaic in late 1993, I think. And in my defense, I thought it would be cool at the time, which I know is not much of a defense. But by the way, we still support this in Chrome today. All modern browsers still support this weird overlapping layering of elements, of tags, formatting tags. But what made this early web so incredibly compelling, so enduring, so viral, although I guess that's probably a bad word to use now, it was in short because it gave access to information. Like, Google's mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. But it's important to realize in context that the world's information in the early 1990s wasn't on the internet. Like, it probably wasn't even in digital form at that point. Like, I had a set of physical encyclopedias as a child. I'm not kidding, like actual physical books. But information was starting to come online, and the ephemerality of web experiences was a perfect platform for publishing information. And as an aside, by the way, if you're new to Google, or if you've been a Googler for a while but you haven't thought about it in a while, this is an awesome mission. Like, this is, as a company mission, this is incredible. I mean, it would be nice if we added something in there about prioritizing truth or something, but organizing information, making it accessible and useful is awesome. Enabling humans to learn is a critical mission. And most critically at NCSA, we had this same idea, like everyone could be an author. Everyone would generate content. We had the idea that web server software should be free and everyone should run a server on their machine. And I mean, maybe that isn't really the way it worked. Keep in mind, at the time, firewalls were exceedingly uncommon. I ran a web server on the PC in my office at NCSA that was accessible worldwide. There was no firewall to get to it. In fact, we wrote a network space dogfight game as a student project while I was at NCSA. We used the PC Telnet networking code. And after we'd been playing it for a while, I had this brainstorm and I realized I'd never actually disabled the background FTP server code from the networking library. So a friend of mine ran the game and I could FTP into his machine and copy files off of it. And that game actually was called Netspace, which is Netscape with 2 letters reversed. And my co-author of Mosaic for Windows, he actually went to Netscape later, and he told me years later that he kept accidentally typing Netspace when he meant Netscape in corporate emails. But we implemented back in this browser that was totally primitive by today's standards. There was no CSS, there was no JavaScript, no HTML tables, not font control. We implemented a group annotation feature. Like, for any web page, you could write annotations on a common server, and whenever anyone in your group visited that page, they would see the annotations you'd written for it, which is really cool. So this may seem obvious now, but in my mind, this is a big part of the digital divide between generations. Is everyone wasn't a content producer before the internet. Like, I didn't spend my teens sharing everything I was doing with everyone around me. I didn't take pictures of my meals at restaurants or share cute pictures of my dog. And more than anything, this is what massively enabled this concept of the long tail. And if you haven't heard this term before, the long tail refers to a probability distribution where a large portion of the overall population is in this tail. Or a simple version of this is the web is incredible because people are just as interested or even more interested in uncommon topics than in the most popular topics. for every interest you may have in the Kardashians, you also have an interest in 17th century weaponry or something. And this is taken for granted today because you can search for anything and find information on it. Yes, Rule 34 is also coming up here, but I'm going to skip over that. But this wasn't true in the early 90s. Like, this information just wasn't necessarily there. In fact, I had a demonstration of this long tail, and a little bit later, in 1996, I took a class in playing the didgeridoo, Australian indigenous wind instrument. Got several of them behind me. And part of the class covered how to make your own didgeridoos. And I put up a GeoCities site showing how to build didgeridoos from pieces of bamboo, complete with ASCII art, because I didn't have a digital camera. Remember, this was like 7 years before Canon came out with the Digital Rebel. And I put my Microsoft email address in this page, and this page stayed up until GeoCities shut down in late 2009. And for all that time, for 13 years, I would consistently get like an email a month where someone would just randomly say, hey, I saw your page and I was wondering if you knew where I could get raw bamboo here in Finland. And by the way, this page is still up. You can still get to it online. If you really want to know how to build bamboo didgeridoos, it's there. Now, I'm telling this story, though, not because I think many of you are interested in didgeridoos or interested in making didgeridoos out of bamboo, but you probably do have some interests that are just as rare. And by contrast, the way that things work today, a couple of years ago, I started building ukuleles in my spare time, and I have several of them behind me too. And I buy my materials and tools online. I learned how to do everything about this online. I watch videos on YouTube of how to bend the wood for the sides, and I compare notes on forums about various kinds of wood, and I browse through exotic wood pieces on eBay, and I'm showing my age because I still find this information access absolutely mind-blowing. And most people today don't really even think about this. Like, this is a massively new natural order. And in a mere couple of decades, we've gone from having to dig to find a community that we can be at all comfortable in to having instant access to almost any community that you might want. And this leads me to something that I've said since the mid-90s about what excites me about working on the web and the internet. And it was that all the internet to me and electronic communication in general really does is it lets human interactions happen faster with fewer barriers, fewer guardrails in the way. Obviously, it removes geographic barriers, but I used to think this was unreservedly a good thing, and I don't really believe that anymore. Maybe I was naively expecting people to mostly try to do good, but this led me to another life credo, which is be careful what you optimize for. I used to only optimize for enabling humans, and now I think maybe we have a responsibility to focus on truth, discourage tribalism. Like, this has been my pinned tweet, by the way, for a super long time, because every decision has consequences, and few of the optimizations that you may make have no side effects. I thought it was a great decision to enable overlapping tags. I didn't really think about the side effects later on. But maybe speeding up human interactions isn't all good all the time. But this is what the web has become the ultimate platform for. And back at Microsoft about 20 years ago, I worked alongside and became friends with this brilliant, wonderful person who unfortunately has since passed on, named Bill Hill. And Bill did some really awesome seminal research in reading in the 90s that really led to the ebook revolution, development of ClearType at Microsoft and things like that. And he published this paper called The Magic of Reading. You can still find it online. And it was eye-opening on the wisdom of books and printing, like why books are the size they are. The design of books comes from thousands of years of determining what's a convenient and readable format. And Bill used this term, that a book was a 300-page water slide for human attention, to describe the power a good book has to engage you. And that's what I feel the web can be, and certainly is today, an infinite water slide for human attention. And that too can be for better or worse. But back to my story. In 1994, the core Mosaic team all left NCSA. Mark Andreessen had already left the previous year. I quit to head to Seattle with my new wife. And Mark and Jim Clark came back to Illinois and scooped up all of the rest of the core development team before they scattered to the winds too. And I went to work for a company called SPRY in Seattle. This is not the same as Spyglass, if anyone's ever heard of Spyglass, but SPRY made this product called Internet in a Box. And the reason that I mentioned this was because Internet in a Box really was everything you needed to get on the internet. If you had a modem, you would take this box home because you would buy it in a brick and mortar store, because we had those. And you would take the box home, you'd install the software on your computer, and it had everything. It had a TCP IP stack. It had a software ISP you could call up to. It had Usenet browser. It had email, FTP, a Gopher client, and oh yeah, a web browser. Because it still wasn't clear that the web was going to be the winner there. Now, the less said about SPRY, the company, the better, although I did gain my best friend from that experience and a strong affinity with Dilbert cartoons at the time. But in 1995, I joined Microsoft in the IE team. Well, I actually started at Microsoft on a different team, but the IE team found out that an engineer with web browser experience had joined the company, and they poached me within a few months. So I joined IE right before we shipped IE 2.0. I did one check-in in IE 2. And this was just as the web browser was really becoming the hottest topic around, because some of you may have heard of this quote before from Mark Andreessen, the co-founder of Netscape, who was quoted as saying that Netscape was going to reduce Microsoft Windows to a poorly debugged set of device drivers. Now, to be clear, Bob claims that the pundit Bob Metcalf originated the statement. He was merely retweeting it, well, quoting it, because keep in mind, this was 1995. The concept of JavaScript was barely invented. Twitter was still a long ways off. And, you know, this may seem like a cheap shot against Microsoft. I don't really mean it that way, because I didn't believe Mark's statement then, as I continued to work for Microsoft for another 15 years. And even after I left Microsoft, I think they're quite well debugged device drivers. So, but Mark's point was really that the web would take over as the center of computing, that the local operating system was effectively dead. And what I don't think I expected or realized is that my expectations of what computing is would change so much from what they were then. Because in context, Mark's statement was made 5 years before the first iPod was released, before the mass adoption of MP3 music. Like, think how much computational functionality has happened since then. This was 8 years before the Canon Digital Rebel. Like, high quality digital photos were hard to come by. You probably shot stuff on film and then scanned it. Like, Lightroom wasn't around for another decade after this. And this, of course, kicked off the browser wars. And this turned into basically a no-holds-barred war between Microsoft and the upstart Netscape. The easiest example of how crazy this war got was everyone's favorite HTML tag, the blink tag. Netscape engineers came up with the blink tag one night when they were out at a bar. True story, apparently. Look it up. Obviously, I wasn't there. But at Microsoft, we hated the blink tag, so much so that even when the Netscape team demanded that blinking be added to the new CSS standard as a text decoration, we insisted that we not be required to actually blink the text, i.e. actually parse this. We would apply it in the CSS cascade, but the text wouldn't blink. In fact, I hate blinking so much, I refused to make this tag blink in my presentation as well. But, you know, at Microsoft, we had to outblink blink, of course. So we came up with the marquee tag, which caused text to scroll around and like a banner marquee, and it lets you format text vertically like a Broadway marquee up against the side of a building. And the funny part, though, was the joke was on us because we couldn't remove this for many, many, many years afterwards, because it ended up being used really heavily in Korea for formatting purposes. Like, they wanted text that ran in exactly that way, that had the same attributes, and we couldn't get rid of it. And in fact, if you search Google for marquee tag, it has a cute Easter egg where it actually does a marquee scroll of the search results. Although, of course, it uses modern technology, uses CSS animation to do this, not the marquee tag itself. Now, at this point, we were basically locked in a feature back and forth with Netscape Navigator. We were adding features like JavaScript, table layout, font features, and I know I'm biased, but even then, I think we had a better engine because our layout engine, which is based on the one that I personally built back in Mosaic at NCSA, it could dynamically relay out the page. If you resized the window, we could relay it out, no problem. Netscape, on the other hand, couldn't. They actually had to reload the page in order to resize. And in fact, in early versions, they had to reload it from the network when you resized the window. And I think this may actually be why they added a disk cache originally, was because they were doing this reload. In fact, in later versions, they realized and they had to hack in a feature where if you resize the window on a page with a form in it, they would have to cache all the form fields, reload the page, and then stick the values back in the form fields so that you wouldn't lose all your work if you resize the window. Now, this experience in layout did lead me to atone for my overlapping tag sin, though, with a significant addition to the web. When my manager came to me as we were wrapping up IE2, and he said, "Hey, we want you to work on frame sets for IE3. I said, "Yeah, frame sets are cool, but there are these two guys at the W3C who've been kicking around this idea called style sheets. And Netscape's not even looking at this yet." And that kicked me off personally coding the first implementation of CSS in a browser. He came back about half an hour later and said they'd found somebody else to do frame sets, so I could go. So another lesson, don't be afraid to speak up, even when you're the new person on the team, and advocate for what you think, because sometimes it turns into amazing stuff. Now, IE3 was the first real serious contender release from Microsoft. IE's browser market share went from about 5% in early 96 to 25% by late 97. And in addition to CSS, this is also where ActiveX was added. That's another talk all by itself. I'm not going to go into that much. But that also heralded another huge change where IE itself stopped being a single monolithic executable. IE became an embedded system API and a set of controls that all developers could be used instead of being one honking big msie.exe, which is what it was before. Like, this may seem obvious now, but at the time it wasn't. This was the first web view. And as we wrapped up IE3, there was some serious contention at Microsoft over that web view. In particular, towards the end of the IE3 cycle, there was another team over on the other side of Microsoft called the Forms Cube team. And they were apparently working on a competitive HTML rendering engine. And at one point, they invited our team to a presentation to show off their stuff. And I was busy, I don't know, like trying to hammer out some more CSS work or something. And a teammate of mine went over. He came back into my office. He sits down, and I'm like, "Hey, how'd it go? You know, did they have anything interesting?" And he said, "We're screwed. We're all out of a job. Like, their system is amazing. And their engine, which was renamed Trident after this, was completely dynamic. Like, prior to this, the only things that JavaScript could dynamically change in a page were images, but not their sizes, because Netscape couldn't relay out, what hyperlinks on the page pointed to, and form input fields. That was it. Nothing else could get changed dynamically in a page. Now, basically everything in the page could be changed. You could edit text in the page. You could relay it out. You could change font size and have it animate or whatever. And obviously, the Trident team was moved over to IE after this. And my coworker was mostly right, because almost everyone from the IE3 rendering engine moved on to other projects. I was actually the only one who was asked to stay on in the new IE team, the Trident team, after shipping IE3. And it was actually because I'd been the one to implement style sheets. In fact, before shipping IE3, after it became clear that Trident was going to replace us in the next release, the Trident team asked me to give them a presentation on CSS and IE. They hadn't implemented CSS at all yet. And I gave them a demo. I explained how CSS worked, how the cascade worked, everything. And then I said, and I hope to get these 2 more features in before we ship. And I remember clearly their response was, "Could you not? Because anything that you implement, we have to be compatible with and we have to implement." And I remember thinking at the time, just for that, I'm going to implement 3 features that you're going to have to do. But another lesson is, job security. Okay, that's kind of a joke, like don't just become an expert for job security. But this was the height of the browser wars era. Like we'd been going back and forth with Netscape. Like there was a minor battle where Microsoft copyrighted dynamic HTML with a capital D, but Netscape copyrighted it with a lowercase d, or maybe it was the other way around, I don't know. But neither of us ended up being able to really use the term. And fundamentally, the IE4 Trident engine gave us a quantum leap forward over Netscape. They were still trying to propose static layer tags in HTML, and we were cranking out dynamic CSS positioning and animation. Like we even shipped something called Active Desktop in Windows 98, which is basically a windowing system for Windows built on HTML and CSS, which was pretty crazy and not maybe the right thing to do. But some of our features were actually awesome and had long-ranging consequences. And in particular, the Outlook team at Microsoft needed a web front end for Outlook servers. And of course, they realized it was kind of crazy to keep transferring an entire HTML page every time the user clicked on a link, like clicked on a new email. So they needed network data transfer capabilities. And a colleague of mine, Alex Hopman, came up with this idea of building a component that could do just that, and then getting it to ship as an ActiveX control with IE. The most convenient vehicle was MSXML DLL. So it got put in there, shipped in IE5, and the whole concept of AJAX was born, this whole concept of doing asynchronous data requests from JavaScript. Now, unfortunately, from Microsoft's perspective, we kind of stumbled around that time. We were largely re-architecting, like cleaning up the work that we'd done before. IE5.5 was actually centered on this native frames work, which was to natively support frame encapsulation instead of just re-embedding the browser control, which was horribly costly in performance and memory. And at the same time, Microsoft itself, the leadership kind of stumbled here, mostly because of this. And this is a chart from the Wikipedia Browser Wars article. It shows browser market share over time. And you'll note in 2001, this near the center of this chart, as IE6 shipped, Microsoft had clearly won. Like we had a vastly better product than Netscape. I mean, our Mac product was better even than our Windows product, I think. But we owned over 90% of the market at that point. And the leadership started getting kind of complacent about that position. And the web as a platform really wasn't very complete. It struggled to lay out anything except tables and flow text. In fact, it was another decade. It was 2012 before we got Flexbox in the web, and even longer to get a solid grid control after that. And additionally, it was getting really hard to change anything that we'd shipped, mostly because Microsoft had what I think is an overcommitment to backwards compatibility. And we had a pretty quirky, well, buggy implementation. And fundamentally, from the leadership's perspective, the web didn't really encourage developers to write Windows software. Now let's take a look at that chart again. Like Microsoft had conquered the browser market. They wanted to retain that browser market, but they wanted to retain the developers and hook the developers to Windows. So they started up this project that was called Avalon. This became the .NET Framework 3.0 team. And this was an attempt to take some of the valuable lessons from the web, like markup and code working together and styling, and apply them all to a custom proprietary platform that would really leverage the power that was in the local Windows platform. And unfortunately, in reality, this just kind of led them to them losing the web market too, because notice that decline in IE's browser share started right around 2002 and 2003. Now, the reason for that, of course, is the world kept turning. I mean, Microsoft was off working on .NET, but first of all, hackers started making money off poor security. Prior to this era, finding exploits in computer code might have been neat, but it wasn't going to make you a ton of money. But suddenly it started actually being financially lucrative, and security problems became rife. And this really forced Microsoft to go focus as a company on that for a while. And also on the web, the mashup pattern was just taking over, like using multiple components and data sources and combining them together in the web platform, because they weren't in incompatible sources. They were all coming in from the same place. Like you could take Chicago crime statistics, you could take a mapping software, and you could take, I don't know, like economic information, combine it all together, and bam, get a great mashup application from it. And this may seem really obvious to us now. Like, again, this is just the natural order, but that's not the way it worked back then. This was groundbreaking. And then, of course, there were several great web engines that were coming up as real serious competitors to IE and the Trident engine. Mozilla finally managed to ship Firefox. And although WebKit had actually started back in '98, it didn't really hit it big until Safari and then Chrome. And the WhatWig was actually formed as well in response to the slow development at the W3C and the W3C's decision to abandon HTML in favor of XML-based technologies, which was definitely, in retrospect, not the right thing to do for browsers. And really, at this period, too, there was a mind shift. And the statement that Ben Galbraith made back in 2006 was one of the best summaries to me, like one of the things that stuck in my head the most about the changing focus of the web in the mid-2000s, because this term Web 2.0 had gotten heavily used to talk about this. And really, in capturing it, he said, it's not about a set of technologies. It's not about using XML HTTP request or CSS or whatever. It's about caring about your user experience. And this was the big shift then, was people really started caring about the user experience that they could build in a web app. And all of these things combined together, and the loss in market share, this led Microsoft to resuscitate the Internet Explorer team. We had a slick new multicolored logo. It was great. But I joined this newly back from the dead team in 2004. I was the group program manager for the web platform team. And we really had a very daunting task in front of us, because the team was basically just the bug servicing team that we started from. We had to rebuild from there. The internal knowledge about the systems had mostly deteriorated, and until we managed to rehire some of the people who'd slipped away before. But we put this together, and in a couple of years, we managed to ship an entirely new platform and browser. And on a personal note, I have to say, like, this was the release in my career that I was most proud of personally, not because of what we shipped, but because we built a team that shipped it. And we made incredible progress given where we started from in 2004, which was basically zero. In fact, we were underwater. We were getting in more security bugs that we had to fix than we had resources to fix when I joined the team. And always keep in mind, you can only do the next right thing to do. You can't always repair everything in one go. And the progress that we made in this release was always one of the things that I was most proud of. And of course, we did get a lot of vilification from web developers too. And this leads me to another lesson. Listen to feedback, but don't let the snarkiness of people get you down, because I once had someone on the IE blog comments who claimed to be Satan, telling me they wanted to hire me because I was so good at my job and they would offer me more money than Microsoft. And I would have deleted this as a fake post, but I couldn't prove it wasn't Satan, and I really didn't want to follow up on it. So in general, though, like, just be nice and don't let the jerks get to you, and don't ever read the YouTube comments. And by the way, I should point out that we're only just now getting to the point in history where Chrome was started. Like, the Chrome project was started in 2006. I'm not going to focus on Chrome, of course, because Peter already covered that yesterday and knew far more about it than I ever will. But unfortunately, this restarted IE team was really chartered and directed to compete as a browser application. Like, the leadership thought of it as, we need a competitive browser application, not we're responsible for this wonderful underlying web platform. And we spent roughly half of our engineering resources from IE7 onward, for as long as I was there, on user experience rather than platform. Like, this really showed in what we accomplished. Like, if you look at what the press said about this, they said that we did tab browsing, we had page zooming, we had search improvements, a brand new RSS feed reader, and then on the platform side, improved standard support, although it does not pass the ACID 2 or ACID 3 tests. And this trend continued, by the way. Like Microsoft continued to underinvest in the platform while sinking a ton of work into reworking the user experience over and over again. IE 7, 8, and 9 all had massive revamps in UI, adding the RSS feed reader, changing how the whole interface looked. But by contrast to the other engines at the time, they really only trickled out the web platform enhancements, despite web developers clamoring for platform updates. And fundamentally, to be frank, this is why I left Microsoft after spending another half decade trying to fix this problem, trying to get the leadership to understand that they really needed to invest. But they did move to Chromium, so I guess I won in the end there. But to summarize, like, I want to put the key lessons of IE together. First, obviously, don't become complacent. But number one, invest in infrastructure. Like, I actually think Chrome does quite well at this. It's definitely hard to make infrastructure work attractive, but I think that we do a good job of continually putting focus on it and continually placing engineering investment in it. And ironically, I actually think Microsoft does more of this now with Chromium-based Edge than they did for years with the Trident engine, and gets more out of it too, of course. Secondly, and a core value at Google is focus on the user. Like, don't focus on the race with a competitor. Focus on what's good for users. And users may mean developers to us, of course. Third, quirkiness may be attractive as a personality trait, but it is just maddening to developers as a platform attribute. Spec your behavior, match your implementation to the spec, encourage other people to do the same. And fourth, and this is a super common failure, this is also known by the epithet not invented here. Like, not all the smart people work at your company. Collaborate openly, honestly. Think about what other people from other companies are saying. You shouldn't just try to convince them to do something different. You should listen to what their intelligence might tell them. And of course, finally, don't ignore potential disruptive factors. I talked about some of those already in the IE space, but I haven't yet mentioned the other factor that really hastened IE's demise, which was the rise of mobile computing. And the personal computing revolution radically accelerated with mobile. Microsoft, frankly, was caught pretty much completely unaware by this. In only a little over a decade, I went from having this awesome Motorola StarTAC on the left, and believe me, this is incredibly advanced when it came out, loved that phone, to a Samsung Blackjack where I finally had a web browser and email, and then to an iPhone. And the iPhone was so groundbreaking because it enabled building these super responsive and engaging mobile experiences. All this amazing interactivity, you touch the screen to do things. The accelerometer was actually a surprisingly good controller for games and the like. And for context, by the way, at the time the iPhone was released, I was over 35, so this was against the natural order of things. And unfortunately, as mobile computing started taking over, the web was certainly not optimized for these small touchscreen devices. Although web layout was a reflow model, at the time, it didn't have a whole lot of controls to carefully design for given form factors. And the hardware status quo in the late 90s had led authors to hard code their screen-based designs, usually to 1024 by 768, because even as screens got bigger, most people just had windows that were roughly 1024 by 768. And this caused a bunch of problems when the iPhone came out, of course. Suddenly a portrait 360 by 480 display was common. But there was also no mouse, no keyboard. You had touch, which didn't quite map onto mouse in the same way. And more than anything, the web platform really relied on an always-on net connection. Like, native apps seem reliable because in general, they'll load and run when you're in an elevator or a subway car. Like, sometimes they don't do a whole lot of useful, like Twitter isn't great without an updated feed, but the app loads and it shows something and you know that it's running. And even more importantly, the user isn't confused about whether native apps should work without bandwidth. I'm usually surprised at apps that don't do something without a network connection. But of course, by contrast, most users wouldn't even think to open up the mobile web browser to do something if they know they don't have a network connection at the time. And that's what led us about 5 years ago to address this with progressive web apps, to really try to improve the reliability of web apps. make them work offline in lower uncertain bandwidth, make them work as an integrated app experience on devices, rather than forcing users to go open a web browser to get to their web applications. And the web really does need to be more than just a network browser. It needs to be a fast, reliable, and more than anything else, engaging platform. And progressive web apps have only begun to address this perception. We still have lots to do. And with that, I want to say a brief word about the challenge that's ahead of us before I wrap up. The web platform as a whole took kind of a stumble with mobile and the lack of app experiences, but we've started addressing this, and we're finally getting to the key here, which is improving the web's ability to absorb new computing technologies. An open standards-based platform is always going to lag the functionality of a proprietary platform, but one big reason that I'm still convinced the web will continue to succeed as the universal platform is we've really started catching up in that access to capabilities. We've been taking on new devices, local hardware, new form factors, capabilities like augmented reality. And the challenge for us is really leading what developers want to build by taking these new capabilities and responsibly enabling them on the web, mapping them to the security and privacy guarantees that we have. Now, many of you are new to Chrome. I think it's great to have a continually fresh perspective, and please don't lose that. We should strive to be agnostic, and that can be challenging to do if you have a static perspective. But overall, you can always come back to some of our core values: respecting the user's needs, respecting the platform, all of the platform, like listen to those outside the company as well as those inside. And don't strive to be the smartest person in the room, strive to be the best listener. Because this really helps drive our mission on the Chrome team, which is bringing fast, seamless, safe, and reliable computing experiences accessible to all, and that supports Google's core mission, of course. And I hope that you'll be as excited about discovering what this means to you as I have been for the last 9 and change years, because this is really what brought me to Google almost a decade ago, and this is what's kept me here since then. And with that, I would like to conclude.